the first question that I want to ask is what does it mean to be a Christian in a worldwide community in which we're rich and others are poor? What does it mean to be a Christian in a place where 25,000 infants die every day, mostly of preventable diseases? What does it mean to be a Christian in a world where 1 billion people live below $1 a day? What does it mean to be a Christian where you have something over 100 million kids of primary school age who are not enrolled in primary school? What does it mean to be a Christian in this world of increasing globalization where we see these, where these differences are more salient than they've ever been? So I want to talk about 3 main points tonight. One is, what helps the poor? What do we actually know from research and development economics that helps the poor? And I want to look at international child sponsorship as a useful example of that in the study that we've done. And then I just want to conclude with a few reflections on maybe kind of a new model of relationship between people in rich countries and people in the poor, kind of an international partnership model. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. The first question is, why is it so difficult to know what actually helps the poor? Why is that such a difficult question? And I'm part of a generation of sort of development economists that have started to take new tools to this question, randomized control trials and different econometric methodologies for evaluating impacts. And we still don't know exactly, but we have a better idea than we did a while ago. Part of the problem is a widespread misunderstanding of causal relationships. When we talk about impact, what we're talking about is the difference between what happens when a given program is in place minus what would have happened anyway if the program weren't there. That is what impact is. It's the difference between what happens to people that are in the program and what would have happened to them if the program weren't there. What we observe, actually, when we, just as human beings, when we observe the difference between, say, kids that are sponsored and kids that are unsponsored, or people with a microfinance loan, people without a microfinance loan, what we observe is the product is the sum of 2 different things. One is the true effect of the program, the effect that the program really has, and the other is a bias, right, that has to do with issues related to self-selection. And so you can think about the difference that we observe is the outcome under treatment of the treatment group under treatment. So that would be does this have a laser pointer? Maybe not. Okay, so it's on the left, the outcome of the treatment group under treatment, that would be like the outcome of the sponsored kids, minus the outcome of the non-treated group under non-treatment. So we observe kids that are sponsored, and we observe kids that aren't sponsored. What we'd really like to observe is what would happen to the kids that were sponsored if they weren't sponsored. All right, so I promise this is the only little mathematical trick I'm going to do in this presentation. But what I'm going to do is take that sort of theoretical concept of what would have happened to the treated group if they weren't treated, and it's called the counterfactual. So in statistics we call that the counterfactual. And I'm going to subtract it from this first term, and then I'm going to add it again to the second term. Because with any equation, you can always add and subtract the same thing, right? You still have an equality. So when we do that, when we have the outcome of the treatment group under treatment minus the outcome of the treatment group under non-treatment, that is the true causal effect of a development program or any program. And then what's left, this bottom set of terms, the outcome of the treatment group under non-treatment minus the outcome of the non-treated group under non-treatment, that's the bias in our observation. That's what would have happened to both of these groups had there been no intervention. Okay? So in other words, people with a microfinance loan, for example, might be better off anyway, even if they didn't get a microfinance loan. Right? Why? Because maybe they're the go-getters that want to improve their own lives, and so they go out and they take a microfinance loan. But the reason they're better than people that don't have loans is because they're more entrepreneurial and forward-thinking and creative and so forth. So they take microfinance loans, but maybe that's not what's responsible for the difference between the two. So in that case, in that hypothetical example, we'd have a big number down here and a small number up here. Okay, because what we observe between the difference between the two is just, it's all bias. It's not actual not actual impact. I'm not saying that about microfinance, but it's just an example. But this is what's really difficult about development work, is actually separating these two effects and what makes empirical work in economics difficult. So let me talk about what we as donors actually observe development organizations doing. And I want to just, from that theoretical basis of the last couple slides, show why it's misleading. Okay, so a lot of organizations will talk about impact by comparing program participants to non-participants. All right, so why doesn't that work? Well, for the reason that I mentioned before. Say non-microfinance borrowers might be worse off than microfinance borrowers anyway, or kids in an education program. The kids that weren't in the program might be worse off anyway, maybe because their parents didn't push them to be part of the program. So maybe the differences between the two are just due to the effect of the parents and not due to the effect of the program. There's one organization that I've worked with that said, well, we know our program has a big impact because the pastor always tells us on the playground the kids in our program are much better behaved on the playground than the other kids. Well, that could be because of the program, but it could be because of other factors. Maybe it was just all the cooperative kids that were willing to be part of the program, or they had better parents or something that's not related to the program at all. A second way that development organizations claim to have impact is through before and after studies. So they'll take a baseline survey, they'll implement the program, and then they'll measure that same thing afterwards in a follow-up survey. But the problem is that even the timing with which people enter into a program is correlated with these outcomes. So sometimes people will enter into a program when they're in some kind of crisis, and they enter the program, the crisis is resolved, and they're better off. Okay, so this is I'll talk about this more later, but this is a problem of mean reversion. Okay, so this is like somebody who goes to the doctor with a cold. You go to the doctor, there's nothing really doctors can do about viruses, right? They tell you to take aspirin and drink lots of water and you'll be better. But have you ever noticed that usually you're better even after you go see a doctor? Right? Well, that's because usually when you have a cold, you get better, right? So it's causal effect. Every time I go see a doctor, I get better, right? It's sort of like my dog when I was growing up. The mailman used to come, and he would bark at the mailman, and the mailman went away every time, right? And so the dog figures, well, there's a causal effect between my barking and this mailman fleeing in fear of my barking, right? But there isn't a causal effect. There's just this spurious correlation. Okay, so what actually does help the poor? So I took this poll about a year and a half ago among 16 of the top development economists in the world. And I asked them to rank from 0 to 10 different kinds of development programs that normal people, all of us, would give money to. Okay, so these aren't just the typical ones that governments provide, these are the typical ones that we provide. And how effective are they in terms of bang for the buck, okay, in terms of impact per dollar. So let's talk about these just briefly, and then we'll talk about child sponsorship. Oops. So these are the top 3. So again, this is ranked from 0 to 10. This is a consensus among our poll among these 16 development economists. So number 1, get clean water to rural villages. All right, sort of a pretty clear number 1. Why is this number 1? For about $10 per person per year, you can provide clean water to a human being. It reduces infant mortality between 20 and 50%, what studies by the World Health Organization show, kind of depending on the context where it's implemented. You can literally save somebody's life for somewhere between $500 and $1,000. Okay, so water is so primal to us that this was number 1. Deworming children. This comes from a famous study by Edward Miguel at UC Berkeley and Michael Kramer at Harvard, where they randomly dewormed children in Kenya. They found that a 50-cent deworming treatment has overwhelming positive effects. For just a few dollars, you can increase the number of schooling days by an entire year in a child's life. Okay, so cheap and effective is an endearing combination for economists. Right? So deworming children is number 2. Providing mosquito nets. A $10 mosquito net can cut malaria in half. Okay? So these are all very simple health interventions, and extremely high bang for the buck. So the middle four, child sponsorship, I'll talk about that more in a second. It comes in with a 6.9. Introduction of improved stoves. Okay, this is something that people give money to. This allows people to have indoor stoves that burn fossil fuels cleanly in their house. So indoor air pollution is a huge problem in the developing world. In terms of its negative health impacts, it dwarfs outdoor air pollution. And this is all in rural areas, which we think are sort of quaint and cozy, but people are poisoning themselves by burning wood or animal dung or different things openly inside their house. Has terrible health effects. So being aware of the research that's been done on the impacts of this, they rank it pretty high. Microfinance, a 4.2. Now why? It seems like microfinance ought to have a higher rating than that. Microfinance is now being taken by almost 200 million people in the world. But every randomized controlled trial that's been done to test the impact of microfinance has found very, very modest impacts at best of microfinance. And you combine that with problems of over-indebtedness and kind of the growing concern that we have about people in debt. And the shift in microfinance has really changed from microcredit to micro-savings, just giving people savings accounts, and also to microinsurance, allowing them to smooth their incomes. So microfinance has not completely, but somewhat fallen out of disfavor in the academic development community. 7, reparative surgeries for children. So this would be like smile train, kind of cleft palate operations. This was ranked lower than I would have ranked it. For $300, I think you can literally change somebody's life. And with the discrimination and feeling unwarranted feelings of shame that these children feel, I would have ranked it higher. Okay, the bottom 3, farm animal donation. So how many people have seen those catalogs with all the animals? You know? Yeah. So farm animal donation, it's just a great marketing tool, right? And we've actually done a study with the Heifer Project on dairy cows in Rwanda, and we find some really big impacts. There's a paper that we're doing that should be coming out soon about it. But these dairy cows cost $3,000. It's a very, very expensive intervention. You need to have just the right kind of environment where people know how to take care of these animals, but they don't have them. And finding that sweet spot is actually pretty difficult. And if you don't have it, you have to spend a lot of money on training. Animals die if they're not taken care of properly, so people don't rank it so high. Fair trade coffee. All right, this fair trade coffee is probably the intervention that has attracted more followers than any of these, that has the smallest impact. In fact, the most rigorous study of fair trade coffee, which was done by a bunch of economists at the University of California, Berkeley, University of California, San Diego, finds zero impact of fair trade coffee over 14 years. And that's not only zero impact on welfare, it's zero impact on incomes of people that participated in fair trade coffee. And the bottom line of why it doesn't work is it actually costs to be certified to grow fair trade coffee, and those costs of the certification are only recouped in certain years when the coffee price is abnormally low. So it's not a wonder that it was ranked second to the bottom. Only thing that seems to have beaten it here is giving computers to children, like 1 laptop per child. These programs. Sometimes when we look at our world and think, what couldn't I live without? My laptop. Okay. So I think every kid in sub-Saharan Africa must need a laptop more than anything, right? So people have done serious evaluations of randomized trials with these computers. There was one done by a group of researchers at the Inter-American Development Bank, found no impact on educational outcomes, no impact on aspirations to learn more. Another study came out recently in Kenya, found essentially the same thing, slightly negative impacts. So it's just one of those sort of good ideas that doesn't seem to work. All right, so let's look at this a little bit at this research that we did with child sponsorship. So child sponsorship is arguably the leading form of contact between people in the rich world, in the developed world, and people in the poor world. So we estimate that there are over 9 million kids that are sponsored internationally. And probably somewhere around 90 to 100 million people that are involved in child sponsorship in some way. They're either part of the sponsoring family, or they're part of a family where one of their siblings or kids is being sponsored. So I want to look at a few questions. We looked at a few questions with regards to the impacts of child sponsorship. One is, how do these impacts compare with other, what are the causal effects of child sponsorship? What changes does it really produce in the lives of these children, especially as they grow up and become adults? How do the impacts compare with other educational-based programs? And then what can we learn generally about development from learning about child sponsorship? And this is from a paper that we recently published on this. So let's look at the top 10 in terms of size child sponsorship organizations. So World Vision is really the 400-pound gorilla of child sponsorship organizations. By far more kids are sponsored through World Vision than any other organization. Plan is second. Compassion, who we evaluated, was third, and you can see the rest. The ones with little crosses are the Christian ones. I'll say faith-based, but all the faith-based ones are Christian, at least on this list. The red ones are organizations that favor or at least lean to a very child-centered approach. So when you sponsor the kid, the child is actually receiving certain benefits, which could be access to programming, a school uniform, nutritious meals, tutoring, other forms of encouragement, being part of a youth group. The blue ones, you sponsor a kid, but you're not really sponsoring a kid. You're contributing money to a community pool of funds that could be used for anything. They could be used, well, maybe not anything, but it could be used to drill freshwater wells, could be used to construct schools, could be used for agricultural training, who knows, right? So, but money is given in the name of the child. Okay, it's not sort of a pure form of child sponsorship. That being said, World Vision in recent years has moved slowly toward a child-centered approach. Okay, I think as they've seen impacts with other organizations. They moved away from it and now they're moving back kind of slowly toward it. Okay. So in our study, we took data on over 10,000 individuals, first-hand data, in 6 countries: Uganda, Guatemala, Philippines, India, Kenya, and Bolivia. We chose these countries, 2 in each major part of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, to be more or less representative of the work of compassion around the world. And these surveys were carried out between summer of 2008 and summer of 2010 in 32 different villages. So our survey methodology looked at kids that had been sponsored when these programs were first rolled out in the villages during the 80s and early 90s. This was a time when Compassion was expanding their program worldwide. And so we wanted to track down the kids that were first enrolled in these programs so that we could compare them to older siblings who were too old to be eligible for sponsorship. So in doing this, we sometimes we ended up rolling up our sleeves and getting into big boxes and basements in Bolivia or Kenya and trying to find these dot matrix printouts from 1982 of the first kids that were enrolled in the program, and somebody would find it and we would all celebrate and throw a party. And then we would hire the village know-it-all to take us around and find all of these families and interview the family about the outcomes of all the siblings and ask them questions about how much education did each sibling get, both the sponsored and unsponsored kids. What kind of job do they have? What kind of house do they have? What's their house made out of? Do they have a cell phone? Roughly, what's their monthly income? So we asked all these questions of these people. And we also interviewed a random sample of 50 to 75 other households in these villages and in the same in neighboring villages. Okay, so all the questions that we asked were designed to be information about the siblings that should be known to the other family members. All right, so how do we actually ascertain the causal effect of child sponsorship and avoid that problem of the bias that we talked about earlier? So luckily for us, and this was really a gold mine for an empirical economist, we found that we heard that Compassion, when they introduced these programs in the 1980s, they had a rule that they stuck to pretty well, which was that only kids 12 and under, when the program rolled into the village, only kids 12 and under were eligible to be sponsored. All right, and so on this graph, you can see this is so all these programs are implemented all through the 80s and early 90s, and this is normalized for every village, so that you can see among all the families that had at least some of their kids sponsored, the probability of being sponsored given the age that you were when Compassion rolled into town. Right? So as researchers, why do we use this age that you were when Compassion rolled into town? It's because it's independent of outcome. I mean, once you control for age and other things, it's independent of life outcomes. But it's not independent of possible improvements that you might experience by being a sponsored kid when you were little. So you can see that after age 12, there's a few that squeaked by when they were 13, and the reason that is because there were some kids that were in the pipeline of sponsorship when they were 11 or 12, and it took extra long for them to be sponsored for whatever reason. And so the organizers of the program didn't want to pull them from being sponsored because they've been waiting so long, and so they let them get sponsored when they were 13. But really, there were just a comparably few of those. But this age eligibility rule is what allows us to identify the impacts of this program. All right, so this is the diagram that when I first showed it to Compassion, so I flew back to Colorado Springs and we were presenting the initial results, which was from our first study in Kenya. And I said, if I were one of you guys working for Compassion, this is the diagram that would get me out of bed every morning. And what this is, it's a set of kernel density functions that are estimated over total years of formal education. Okay, so this would be kindergarten, this would be middle school, high school, university over here. And what this is it's establishing different density masses over what fraction of the group, of these different groups, actually drops out of school. So you can see that, so the black line are the kids that are sponsored, right? And everybody else is a younger sib of a sponsored child, an older sib of a sponsored child, or not sponsored, like they were in the village but they weren't sponsored. And you can see that in Kenya, by far the modal time at which they drop out is about 8th or 9th grade, but not for the sponsored kids. Sponsored kids, you can see the density function is totally different. I mean, the modal time where they drop out is actually past high school, right? So some drop out at this point, but many more continue on past this point. So this alone is almost sufficient proof of impact, right? I mean, when you have the sponsored kids that are outperforming their siblings and other kids in the village so dramatically, but we want to control for other things. Okay, this is an example from Uganda where you see the same phenomenon. Okay, where you notice that by far you have more kids in the black line finishing, dropping out of school at a much later period. Okay, so here's the so we do some kind of more formal econometric estimations, but here's just kind of a nice bar chart that identifies causal effects pretty well. So this is the same thing along the horizontal axis here, the age at program introduction into the village, and so these are kids that were 1 or 2, 3 or 4, 5 or 6, 7 or 8, all the way up to 15, 16, 17 or 18. So these guys were not eligible for sponsorship. Okay, they weren't eligible, and you can see that. And the light bars are the compassion households, the ones that have compassion kids. The dark bar are non-compassion households. So notice the difference between the light bars and the dark bars here among all these ineligible kids in the village, right? And of all the ones that are age eligible, you can see the difference between the compassion households and the non-compassion households. Okay. Okay, so this is secondary school completion. Here you can see that that the non-compassion households actually had higher levels of secondary school completion, and then here the households with sponsored kids actually have higher levels of secondary school completion on the other side of the eligibility line. So there are a number of other impacts that we found. One is that we found spillover effects on unsponsored siblings. So these were on younger sibs. We estimate it's a borderline statistical significance, but we find these pretty large impacts on secondary school completion of kids that weren't even sponsored. They were just the younger sibs of the sponsored kids. And over in the field, we heard, I never would have gone to secondary school except for my older brother who was sponsored, who finished secondary school. And then my parents made sure that the rest of us did too. And we saw that it could be possible. So there's this kind of role modeling effect. There may be another effect, which is that parents just want equal outcomes for all the kids for which it's still possible. Maybe it's kind of water under the bridge for the oldest kids, right? Because they've already dropped out early, but the younger kids still have this possibility of continuing. And so parents want fairness, and they encourage the younger kids even to continue. We also find this really big impact over a small baseline, but a really big impact on university education. So the baseline is only 4.3%, and which is kind of what you'd expect for in developing countries. Very small percentage of non-compassion kids go to the university, but we find a statistically significant impact of between 2.1 and 3.6%. So like a 50 to 80% increase in university completion. And we think, see, they're not even sponsored, most of them, at least a few are, but very few are sponsored at the university. This just has to do with the higher rate of high school completion. You just have a higher percentage of kids that are eligible to go on to college. Another thing that we find is that the impacts of the program in Africa and on education are a lot bigger than in Asia and Latin America. We also find that, and this is probably because existing outcomes are a little bit lower in that part of the world. So compassion or child sponsorship seems to be kind of the great equalizer. If you implement it in places where there are really bad existing outcomes, everybody finishes secondary school pretty much. Not everybody, but so many kids finish secondary school that you have a really big impact. Whereas if you implement the program in a country like the Philippines, which had pretty good educational outcomes anyway, the impact is smaller. Right? So, and we also find that between genders, there's some countries where the baseline outcome for girls was higher, and the impact in those countries was bigger on boys, like Philippines, Guatemala, India. In countries where the baseline outcomes were better for boys, the impact was greater on girls. Right? So it just seems to kind of create this level playing field. And actually, one other thing I want to mention that was on, let's see, I guess it's not on this slide, but we also compared it to a conditional cash transfer program to Progresa in Oportunidades in Mexico, which is a very famous program that gives moms cash to keep their kids in school, and found that the impacts of the compassion program on education were about twice what Oportunidades was in Mexico. And this is a program that has been so celebrated the World Bank has replicated it in 25 other countries throughout the world. And the compassion outcomes are about twice that. We also find really interesting impacts on employment. So kids who were sponsored when they were adults were about 5 or 6 percentage points more likely to have salaried employment when they were an adult, and the baseline there is about a third actually have salaried employment. So a lot are moms with kids that don't have salaried employment. And then they're about 6.5 percentage points more likely to have a white-collar job, so some kind of professional job, teacher, nurse, business person, programmer, over a baseline of only 18.5%. So this represents about a 35% increase in white-collar employment. So what we see with these guys is it's actually not the case that these sponsored kids go on to become, get their MBA and become business people or doctors or lawyers or engineers. Mostly what happens is we see this causal impact from being, peasants to being school teachers, or from being manual laborers to being pastors, or nurses, or public health people, or government bureaucrats, or something like that. So it's this. So they end up in these sort of humble service industries. We also find impacts on community leadership. They're more likely to be church leaders, more likely to be community leaders. So basically, they end up as adults, kind of as compassion intends for them to be as adults, working in these sort of public servant kind of occupations, involved in their churches. involved in the community. These are just some results from some new work. Income and wealth impacts. We actually show that we find about a $17 to $25 increase in monthly income for people who are sponsored, and this is over a baseline of only like $77 over the whole sample, or about $190 or something over $198 over those that are working. And we actually find that the benefit grows over time. It starts small and then it seems to increase as these guys age. All right, so why does child sponsorship work? All right, so we carried out a follow-up study on a completely different population than our first study. This was a study that we did in India, Kenya, Bolivia, and Indonesia. It was on about 1,400 kids, and what we found is that, and so this was on kids, not on adults, and what we found is that the sponsored kids had higher rates of self-esteem, higher self-expectations for vocation and education, especially in Kenya. We found these really big impacts in Kenya that kind of reflect the same sorts of magnitudes that we find in the adult outcome study. In other words, from the time these guys are sponsored, when they're little kids, they expect to have more education than their peers who aren't sponsored. So it seems like at some level these adult outcomes are the product of, we think, of self-expectations that are formed when kids are 7 or 8, 9 years old. That themselves may be the product of all this work that Compassion does to build aspirations of kids. So we did these psychological tests, and so we're a bunch of economists, and we kind of delved into psychology. And there's this hierarchy of psychological data that psychologists will talk about. So at the bottom of the pyramid, this is the worst kind of psychological data. These are hypothetical behavioral responses, which would be like, if I shocked you with this cord, what would you do? Okay, I would scream, right? Then there would be reported behavioral characteristics. Like, if I shock you with this cord, what kind of person do you think you would, what kind of response might you elicit? Are you the kind of person who would be angry, or the kind of person who would not be angry? Reported behaviors. The last time you were shocked by a cord, what did you do? Okay, that's a little higher up on the pyramid. Observed behaviors. When I shocked the subject with the cord, he let out a yell and showed multiple signs of agitation. Okay, all right. So the trick is to get at observed behaviors, not these sort of what would you do if, or what did you do the last time, but to actually get observed behaviors that, in our case, are able to reflect measures of self-esteem and hope. So what we did, and we were sort of turned on to this by this Bolivian child psychologist who told us about this experiment that's used often by clinical psychologists more than researchers, which is the use of children's drawings. And so there's a long literature that starts in the 60s about an analysis of children's drawings. And what psychologists have noted are these empirical correlations between what children draw in their self-portraits and these clinically diagnosed disorders or non-disorders. So the question we asked, based on the advice of the psychologist, is to ask children to draw a picture of themselves in the rain. Why draw a picture of yourself in the rain? Well, being in the rain is kind of a bad place to be, right? And the question is, how does a child view themselves when they're in this uncomfortable, challenging situation? And we can learn a lot from what they actually draw. So what they've shown is that missing facial features on a child's self-portrait are empirically correlated with shyness. So it's not a theory, it's just a correlation that they've established over time in the literature. If they draw themselves as a little tiny figure, less than 5 centimeters, or less than 2.5 centimeters, it's empirically correlated with strong levels of insecurity. A big monster self-portrait, especially with teeth or genitals, is, not surprisingly, aggression. Using dark colors over light colors, so if they draw in very dark colors, it's correlated with depression. If they hold an umbrella with this in the rain question, it's correlated with self-efficacy. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a few of the drawings. And so we coded every drawing with what in econometrics we call dummy variables, 1, 0 variables. So For example, there's one category that uses dark colors. If that dark colors, it got a 1. Holding an umbrella, 1 or a 0 is the child. So 20 of these categories that are all related to self-esteem, self-efficacy, happiness, hopefulness. So here are 2 kids. Here are 2 drawings from 2 kids in Indonesia. So this one is in the 17th percentile of happiness. Okay, so what are the characteristics associated with this? Child chose dark colors. You can see the frown on the kid's face, missing hands, missing feet in that picture. Here's happiness, 92nd percentile. Notice the age doesn't have that much to do with it after a point. I mean, these are kind of like my 3-year-old would draw. I mean, kind of funny toes, but they're all there, right? And hands. And you can just see in the kid's expression, there's a missing nose, which would sort of knock it down just a notch in terms of self-esteem. But you can sort of see the happiness that's reflected in the drawing. So this next one is self-efficacy. So here's a child who's drawing ranked in the 8th percentile of self-efficacy. So she's kind of standing there under the rain cloud. You sort of think, if she just moved like 1 foot to the right. Yeah, so not like super high up self-efficacy displayed in there. Also, you've got lightning bolts in there and the dark colors, so that's not too good on some other things. And then you have child number 253 over here, who is just dressed to the nines with water-repellent gear. Right? So she's got the raincoat, she's got the galoshes going, the hood, the umbrella. It's raining all around, but she's happy and safe under her umbrella. Okay, notice there's something in this picture that wasn't called for, which is the sun peeking out from behind the clouds, right? Okay, so this is hopelessness. So remember, this is a negative attribute, hopelessness. So this is, I believe, it's a 14-year-old girl who drew this picture, and this is about an 8-year-old boy. So you can see, like, this isn't about how good the drawings are, it's just sort of how do you portray yourself. So body posture, missing nose, hands held behind the body, no legs drawn. These are all correlated empirically with feelings of depression or hopelessness. Some sort of dark colors in there. And look at the 8-year-old boy. I mean, okay, he has a square head. I mean, nobody's perfect, but yeah, his pants are a little funny, but yeah, he's holding his umbrella, right? Which is partially cooked. Yeah. So, okay. All right. So using so we did we created some psychometric indices from these drawings, and what we found is that the sponsored kids are way more hopeful about the future. So 0.8 of a standard deviation. Now, people who aren't familiar with statistics may not have a feel for impacts in terms of standard deviations. Usually, a few tenths of a point is a big impact when we're talking about moving people outside of the mean. 0.8 of a standard deviation is a big bag full of hope. Okay, this is somebody who's moving from kind of average hope to being significantly optimistic about their future, or somebody who's feeling slightly pessimistic to feeling actually optimistic about their future. They're about half a standard deviation more happy, and about a third of a standard deviation, indicating about a third of a standard deviation higher in self-efficacy. Okay, their kind of confidence about what they can do and handle different situations. All of this statistically significant. So we're still not really sure exactly what the causal channels are. It could be that child sponsorship causes higher hope and aspirations and self-esteem, which drives the adult life outcomes directly, but that there aren't so many channels directly from child sponsorship to adult life outcomes, and this is like educational and vocational life outcomes. It could be that child sponsorship drives both of these, but there's very little impact here. Or it could be that child sponsorship, I think this is the most likely, is that child sponsorship impacts some adult life outcomes more directly, probably through just providing uniforms, tuition, keeps kids in school longer, also impacts their hope, aspirations, and self-esteem, which in turn impacts their adult life outcomes. So in my opinion, it's more likely number 3, but we haven't established a clear causality there. All right, so I wanted to conclude with just a couple of thoughts about what maybe we can learn from child sponsorship. And I want us to maybe think a little bit about in the world that we live in today, as opposed to 100 years ago, where communication is so good between people across the world, and we're so much more aware of needs and how the poor live. 100 years ago, most people that had no idea how people lived in sub-Saharan Africa that were, say, in Illinois, in Lincoln's time or something. People had no idea. Now we do. So what's the role what's a role, or maybe a new model for the role that Christians can play in this kind of world where these inequalities remain? So let me talk about a few kind of common models that have been implemented across the church. So one is ignorance, and I don't mean ignorance in a common way. I mean sort of ignore ants. Just kind of ignoring the problem and focusing on personal spiritual growth, fulfillment, dealing with personal sin, and those kinds of issues. And some churches, more or less, take that approach. Second approach is the missionary model, which I would argue also comes in a secular version, which is essentially writing checks and faithfully praying and supporting a missionary who leads the work. All right? So getting behind somebody from the church who does the work in another country. Peter Singer, I don't know how many people are familiar with Peter Singer. He wrote the book The Life You Can Save a few years ago that had a big impact in many secular circles and some Christian circles. I don't think he's a Christian. But he talks about, the story that he tells is of somebody who is walking home, and there's in a nice $500 suit, and there's this child who's drowning in a dirty lake. Would the person jump in the lake and ruin his suit to save the child? And then when he asks that question to people, they say, of course. And then he says, well, for $500, you can bring fresh water to a village and save the life of a child. Why don't you do it? Right? And that's the challenge. And there's a good point to this, although I feel like Singer's perspective is almost the North American and European is ATM machine. Okay? Sort of give, and his ethical perspective is give and give and give until the situation you put yourself in is as bad as the people you're trying to help. Right? But that's the only correct ethical response. Okay, so this is one perspective. The third is the incarnational model. And for people who read Christianity Today a couple of weeks ago, the cover story was on Slumdog Saints. People who go and live incarnationally in a poor area. And so these are, kind of the stereotype would be kind of the white people who sort of go and live either in the American inner city or overseas. The example in Christianity Today was living in the slums in Bangkok and working among the poor. So this is sometimes known as the new urban monasticism. The rich relocating in the midst of the poor to help them. It involves some identity change, right? And we all have a lot of respect for people who do this. I want to offer a new model, which is an international partnership model. Okay, and I would argue that a new model of Christian involvement with the poor in the kind of globalized world that we live in today should have at least 5 characteristics. So these are, I would say, necessary, but maybe not sufficient. One is that it should clearly and positively impact those we seek to help. So just no matter how much we sacrifice, whether it's through giving or going and living with the poor, if it's not positively impacting the people that we're trying to help, then it's maybe not a good model. It should be based on a concern for others more than our feelings. And so no matter how good it feels to give that alpaca to the girl down in Bolivia, okay, from the catalog, that we shouldn't give based on our feelings, but out of a true altruism for another human being and based on their welfare, looking to them first, which seems to be more of a biblical model. I would also argue, unlike Singer, that it should involve us personally as well as our resources. That just writing checks doesn't excuse us, or even deny us, I would say, the blessing of being among the poor and serving among the poor. I would also argue that it has to operate through holistic transformation. So some missions organizations would disagree with this, that we ought to focus just on spiritual needs. Other secular organizations are saying spiritual needs are irrelevant. We should just focus on material needs. The biblical view, you could spend weeks talking about this, seems to be about holistic transformation of human beings, not just spiritual, not just material. And I would argue that it should embody committed, long-term, non-patronizing relationships. All right? And I want to tell a couple of stories that I think are examples of this. So one is a story of a friend of mine named Tom. It's actually not about him, it's about his dad. Tom's dad is a United Airlines pilot. And he decided when he started being a pilot that his life was going to be about sponsoring kids. And because he's a pilot, he can fly around all over the place. And so Tom's dad apparently has sponsored 30-something kids all around the world in different places. And he doesn't do a lot of other ministry stuff. What he does is he flies around and he visits his kids all over the world. And that's just what he does. And he loves doing it. And he doesn't really do it with anybody else. He gets free tickets to go everywhere. So he flies around the world and visits his kids and makes sure they're doing okay. And that's his ministry. And so this is an example of, it's not the incarnational model. Tom's dad hasn't moved into the village to help people with things and do things for them. He's committed to walking alongside these people with this sort of new ability that we have to move ourselves across the world reasonably quickly, to visit them, care for them, check up on them, Skype with them. Right? Another example is, I'll give just from my own experience, which is a group of friends of us from InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at UC Davis got together and we decided, we were like 40 years old, and we decided, we have about 20 or 30 good years left, realistically. So why don't we commit them to a single village, right? And so we founded this organization called Mayan Partners that works with one village called Pañabar in the western highlands of Guatemala. And so we have a tiny NGO. It only takes in $25,000 a year. It's very, very, very small. We have no employees. We do sort of everything ourselves. And we support a Christian middle school there, and we do health clinics there. We don't do everything there. We do some wood stove intervention. We've done some of that there because a lot of people are cooking on 3 rocks, and indoor air pollution is a big deal. But we've essentially said that we're gonna stick it out with these guys until we're too old that we can't do it anymore. So we're gonna spend the next 20 or 25 years of our lives walking through them and their problems at the school, with any conflicts, different issues that might come up. We send teams down there once or twice a year to check up on things, bring new people to introduce them to the ministry. And it's really just like extended family. When we go down and visit them, I have the same feeling of when I go see my cousins that I haven't seen in a while on the East Coast. And I think the international partnership model, we haven't moved down there, although actually a couple people in our group did live down in the village for 5 months. But in general, most of us that are involved, of the 30 of us or so that are involved, most of us have only been down there for a couple weeks at a time. So we're not incarnating down there, but we're in constant contact with them in email and just helping them to kind of walk through life. And this is a village where the average level of education is 2 years among women, 3 years among men, to help them themselves to solve their problems in their village with some resources that we bring to the table. So it's a different kind of partnership. So here's some other examples. One church, one village. A church adopting a village, not for 2 years, not for 5 years, but a church, say, here in Illinois, building a friendship with a church in Rwanda, Kenya, Guatemala, wherever it might be, for the next 20 to 30 years. We're so afraid of commitment, aren't we, today? We don't like to talk about decades of commitment, but why not? Even people who move into the inner city, isn't it often just for a couple of years, right? And then you're gone, and then the relationships fade away. What about committing ourselves to someone, almost like a marriage? I mean, not exactly like that, but to walk with them through the different things that they have to overcome for the long term. Another example is international student ministry. So building a long-term relationship with an international student from a developing country and continuing that relationship, being the one who continues to initiate who Skypes the other person to check up on them and how they're doing, who prays for them. And these ought to be symmetric relationships. And part of it means sharing our stuff with them, that we're not the one who sort of comes with the goodie bag to sort of to bring all the gifts, but to share what we're struggling with too and ask them to pray for us. Visiting frequently as much as we can, living a simple lifestyle so we can afford to have a few partners around the world. Not buying some things that we think we need but we really don't in order to sacrifice for others. Okay, so how does God want you to respond to the poor overseas? My advice is maybe start by sponsoring a child and see where it takes you. So thanks for having me here.
Bruce, we have some time for some questions and answers. I have a roving mic. This may be a logistical disaster. Nevertheless, I've queried my advisors, and they said this is the way to go in this venue. So, Eric, I see your hand up. Are you the first?
I wait.
Yeah.
Should I wait for them?
Here it comes.
Thanks for showing those models. That was really helpful. I have a question about that. If you could maybe help distinguish a little more between the incarnational and the international partnership model. Does it possibly seem to you that the incarnational model is a subset of the international partnership? It just involves co-location? Or are you saying that there's something inherently better about not being co-located?
I'm not sure. I think I myself am still trying to sort of figure out what the difference is. But I'll have to say, I think the international partnership model certainly doesn't imply incarnation. I think it implies personal contact, not just check writing. But let me just kind of throw this out. Maybe this is a little bit provocative, and I'm not trying to oversell this model, because I have tremendous respect for people that they're in the incarnational model. But let's take an example of a graduate of Wheaton College who's a computer science major. You guys have computer science? Okay. Who's a computer science major, and let's think about him or her kind of after graduation. So one thing that person could do would be to go live in the slums of Nairobi, right? And engage in relationships with kids, be there as a resource. Maybe, but have to find some way to live, so let's assume that they're sponsored through some kind of missions organization. Well, average missionary today, at least missionary family, draws about some kind of six-figure number of resources, right, to be in the country. There's no doubt that they're probably going to have some impact, but suppose that same graduate were to commit to a different type of lifestyle, where they would get a job as a computer scientist and then send half their income to Kenya to support indigenous people to work in their communities. And not only commit to just send the money, but commit to sort of walk with these people through life and to support them in tangible ways, or at least one or two of them. I wonder who has more impact, one American or 7 Kenyans working in their own community. It's just a thought. I mean, it may be that sometimes, at least in some cases, it may be that the thing that a community needs most is not another white person moving into the community, but for indigenous leadership to be built up in the community that can help for the community to solve its own problems. So what we see in places like Haiti, for example, is that NGO work has essentially replaced all of the normally functioning institutions in that country. If your kid wants to go to a good school, where do you send them? To the Haitian public school? Or even a Haitian private school? No, you send them to the NGO school. If you need a loan, do you take a loan from a Haitian bank? No, you take a loan from an NGO microfinance organization. If your kid's sick, do you send them to a Haitian hospital? No, you go to the hospital that the NGO operates. And so there's been this replacement of the normal functionings of a society by super well-intended people. But when the earthquake hit in Haiti, there were 40,000 expat Americans in Haiti that made the news because there were so many, and they weren't on vacation. They were essentially in our incarnational model, living among Haitians, carrying out work as missionaries and other kinds of caregivers. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's something that I think we should sort of think about relative to other models of empowerment of Indigenous leadership.
So you mentioned the benefits of sponsorship on a child's self-esteem, but what about children in other households who aren't sponsored? Could this actually be a detriment to their self-esteem?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question, and that, I think, in response to that question, World Vision and Plan and other organizations moved away from the one-to-one sponsorship model because they were concerned about the impact of kids that weren't sponsored in the village. And I think my response would be, if you see something that works, the response usually isn't to shut it down and move to a different model, it's to scale it up. And so my question would be, I guess, to some child sponsorship organizations, why not have a model that just sponsors every child in the village and be working in fewer villages rather than more, if that's a priority? Because it doesn't seem like there's any reason you couldn't do that.
Have you thought of looking at the impact, not just on the children, but on surrounding communities and from this compassion organizational structure? The sites I visited actually had anecdotally had very positive impacts with the compassion staff and organizational transparency and accountability and things, that when they were partnering with, say, local governments, they were actually demonstrating business practices that could potentially have great impacts into typically opaque bureaucratic procedures with government organizations they're partnering with. Have any thought of looking at not just impact on children, but other associated organizational systems?
That's a really neat idea. The only problem is just from like a pure research perspective that sometimes those things are really hard to measure. You know, they're hard to measure, and sometimes the impacts are broad, but they're not very sharp. And so, with those kinds of interventions, it's often hard to pick up significant effects from them. But anecdotally, it seems like you do see those impacts, but I can't say for certain.
Just going back a little bit to the incarnational model, are you advocating for a complete shift away from that and more towards this international partnership model, or are you advocating for just more of a limited experience with this incarnational model?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm advocating against the incarnational model, but I think we need to look at it a little more critically than we have, because I think there may be something with the incarnational. First of all, we should really look at the effects of Americans living in villages and working with people. I mean, one of the best examples of this actually is a secular example, which is the Peace Corps, right? And the Peace Corps just has notoriously low impacts in villages. You know, you're there for 2 weeks. You have a sociology major in there who's 22 years old who's trying to teach people to grow carrots or something. And it's just, and it's like, as far as like goodwill ambassador effect, great. As far as like real impact on poverty, not great. So the question is really, and I think also with the incarnational model, I mean, if we're really honest about it, there's kind of what I guess I would sort of call the half dome effect. Do you guys know Half Dome in Yosemite? People scale up Half Dome. Incredibly difficult. I have amazing respect for people that do it. What's the impact of scaling Half Dome on the poor? I'm not really sure. I don't think it's really there. So the point is that amazing personal sacrifice is neither a necessary or a sufficient condition for impact on others' lives. Okay, it may be. In certain cases, amazing personal sacrifice might produce long-lasting and profound effects on other people's lives. And if that's the case, especially with, for example, living in unreached people group areas, like, or in Muslim areas, and being a Christian witness incarnationally, no doubt. But we need to look at it a little more carefully, and not just, it's not just about us, you know, and our relationship with God. It's about actually what's happening to the people, and what's the real impact that we're having on the people around us. That's all. But like I said, I have tremendous respect for people that are sort of living the incarnational model.
Yeah, hi. So of those child sponsorships organizations you showed in the beginning, which of those do you think is most effective and has greatest impact?
Yeah, wow. Well, the only one I've really worked with I've worked with World Vision before, and I've worked with World Relief before, but not on child sponsorship. The only organization I've worked with is Compassion. So I can't answer that question exactly. However, I would say that I think that the organizations that favor the direct child development model, which were so scorned by the rest of the industry 10 years ago, I think have demonstrated that their approach, really getting under the hood of human beings and working to relieve both the external constraints that they face, so like getting more schooling, but also the internal constraints that the poor feel of. I'm worthless, I'm no good. If you've ever been to the slums of Nairobi or Bangkok or Manila, you know, you see kids that are from these large families that are that just grow up in environments where they're told again and again in so many subtle and overt ways that you can't do it, that you're nothing, that you're worthless. And relieving their external constraints, providing more schooling, building more hospitals, sure, it's probably going to help some. But I think the organizations that really care for people in this holistic way and help relieve the internal constraints and develop their self-efficacy, their relationship with God, teaching them how important it is not only to receive but to give back to others is really, really important. I'm concerned about organizations like World Vision that provide a lot of stuff for people. Because if you think about it, how does a child grow up in a family who's provided for everything by their parents? What kind of message does that send? It sort of sends a message like, I don't think you can provide this for yourself. You need me to provide this for you, right? So every time we just give somebody something, then we send them a subtle message that I don't think you can provide this for yourself. And I think we need to be sending the opposite message, that that you can, and your community can overcome the challenges that it has. And it's indigenous leadership that's actually going to overcome those challenges if it's going to be a lasting impact.
I guess as a follow-up to that, I've been involved we've sponsored a couple different kids, Compassion and World Vision, and our experience was Compassion did an awesome job of building that relationship side. But it's interesting as you talk about, you say child sponsorship, but Compassion's style may be unique, right? Because it really, I believe, pushed the relationship side of the component. And I'm just curious if you would think you would ever have the ability to maybe do the same analysis with another organization that is doing more community development.
Yeah.
Because your gut's telling you, I
Right.
think it's better to put it invest in the child instead of the community. But I'm just curious if you think you'll ever have the chance to really
I hope
that
so,
kind of
because
same analysis.
we certainly tried. We certainly tried. So far, the community-oriented organizations haven't wanted to have outside people evaluate it.
Can I keep it for you? I just want to thank you for not only for what you're doing in Guatemala, for what you said about they're your family, because I've been working for 10 years in Africa, and there's just no other way to put it. I mean, that is huge. And when you talk about incarnational, that living in the community and building trust and relationships and stuff it's a big deal, but I'm just a person that didn't live incarnationally and did build those kind of relationships. They are possible. It takes so much time, and so much work to develop trust and that kind of thing, but it's so worth it. So I just want to thank you, and I also want to thank you because I happen to have a sponsorship organization that I'm trying to do in Uganda, and I can blog on your research. I mean, I can take that and go, hey, this is a big deal, and hopefully generate people who might want to sponsor some of my kids, you know, so that not only did you prove that it's really positive, but those of us who are trying to do it can use that information and maybe generate greater,
What do you do with your kids that are sponsored?
what do you mean?
I mean, the kids that are sponsored?
In my group?
Yeah.
We provide tuition for education, and we're trying not to do the orphanage route. We don't feel like that's a good outcome. We're trying to keep the kids in homes
Yeah.
with jajas and aunties and guardians and stuff, and so give them education. They have to have shoes, clothing, medical care as needed, food, shelter. Hopefully they can provide if we can provide the tuition, but we're there if they need it. It's a farming community. It's very rural, so
Yeah,
they do have
yeah.
food.
That just sounds like such a great model. It's like you're kind of coming in and providing some things that they need, but you're not trying to come in and solve
Right.
everything.
And a really big deal is that, this has to be Africa, I don't know about other countries, but they really do regard America up here like this, and to bring America down and go, no, really, you know what, I'm not Ugandan, and I don't know how to live in Uganda, I need you to teach me. To get to the point in your relationship with someone where they'll tell you that what your idea is not a good idea is huge.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm talking too much.
That's great.
Thanks a lot.
No, you're not talking to me. That's fantastic.
Hi, thanks for being here. When you study those kids, in the studies in the villages, do you see any impact on the local church from the compassion kids that are, have more hope, that probably more of them have made a profession of faith because of their involvement, or do you see any measurable effect?
Yeah, we didn't survey local churches, but we did survey asking the families, is sibling X a church leader, which we defined pretty liberally. In other words, like in any kind of leadership role, could be like the choir, working with youth, just anything, collecting the offering, just to measure some kind of greater involvement with the church, and we do find an impact there.
So I'm wondering about the scalability thing that you brought up, and in a couple ways, sort of what you think, like let's say the word gets out, child sponsorship works, and there's a sort of huge influx of resources into this. So a very general question is, what do you think would be the best way to scale up? I mean, you mentioned like you combining the two models and sort of taking, sort of doing the child sponsorship and doing it in a whole village. The other thing I'm wondering about your data or the compassion program is, do you observe variance in like how many resources and the kind of resources are put into each child? So the other thing is like, does anybody play around with like, could we just pour tons of resources into, individual children or individuals? Because I'm thinking of the idea that what you're doing is you're bumping them up, is you're getting them into a little bit more education and a little bit better job.
Yeah.
So, is there any way to target, like how can we create sort of, high ability, university grads, MBAs, leaders, people that would then percolate up into where sort of institutions get made, in a society?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So compassion does have this thing that I didn't mention before called the LDP, the Leadership Development Program, where they actually do select, I don't want to say the best, but the kids that are, say, most successful in school show the greatest potential to be community leaders. And instead of terminating sponsorship when they finish secondary school, which is what's normal, they sponsor them through the university. And that's exactly what they try to do, is develop a cohort of people that are able to be leaders of communities, even leaders of provinces and countries. In terms of scaling up, what I always tell people, we see the biggest impacts of all the kids that we look at, the biggest impacts are on girls in sub-Saharan Africa. Girls in sub-Saharan Africa. And I've said in interviews and stuff before, if you want to do something good in the world, sponsor a girl in sub-Saharan Africa. If you want to do something great, sponsor 10. Because it's just, you see huge impacts in education, huge impacts in their in adult life and the kinds of jobs that they have. It's just really almost miraculous. So that would be the direction that, and actually compassion has sort of bought into this, that sub-Saharan Africa right now is just a place where, because the institutions are improving in general in sub-Saharan Africa too. So once people have more education, there's actually greater possibilities for employment as well. So yeah, so that would be
Hi, I was just wondering if you could explain a bit more about the selection process for which kids are sponsored, like especially
Yeah.
with Compassion being a Christian organization, like how
Mhm.
closely that is linked with the church, like is it only
Yeah.
kids in the church who get sponsored?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. So here's how, all right, there's how it's supposed to work and how it does work. And I'll be honest, I don't think even the people in Colorado Springs at Compassion know exactly how it works in the field. But this is how it's supposed to work, is that they work, Compassion only works through the local church. And they're very proud, excited, steadfast in that model, which is different than other organizations. So the people in the local church that are working with Compassion actually choose at least the families. I'm not sure to the extent that they choose individual children. I think they may, but kind of my gut is that just from talking to people in the field, like how are the kids selected, because we asked this question about 1,000 times when we're doing the research. It kind of seems like the church selects these really needy families, and let's be honest again, they disproportionately choose evangelical Christian families in the village. They just do. Part of that is because maybe you have a bias. Part of that is just because who you know. Because these communities are really tight, and so they know more about the needs in their own community. So these kids are selected more than others. But I think ultimately it's the family that decides which children are going to be sponsored. And in some places like Africa, it's 1 kid per family. In India and the Philippines, it was 2 kids per family. In Guatemala, it was 3. In Indonesia, it was no more than half, I think, of the kids. So there are different rules by country. They do that so to kind of spread the benefit over more families. That's the reason. But it generates a lot of criticism. You know, just somebody asked a question up here about the effect of the kids that aren't sponsored, which is a totally valid question. And I think it's a trade-off, to be honest.
Thank you again for coming. I would be curious, how would you go about measuring, maybe the difference between those who kind of have more of a dispersed program, like a WV or a plan, and then kind of the more intentional, just kind of pouring into maybe one child's life? Because it seems like you might have some difficulty doing research on a broader spectrum approach.
Yeah.
In terms of like quantitative data and stuff like that.
Right.
So how would you go about that?
Okay, I'll tell you what we proposed to World Vision, which still may happen, and that is look, because their programs tend to, at least during the time that we could analyze, which would be projects implemented probably in the 90s or early 2000s, they did a lot of infrastructure development with the child sponsorship funds, which could be very, very good, especially providing fresh water to villages could be a very, very good thing. So what we proposed was looking at variables like infant mortality and child health around the time of implementation, maybe using secondary data that's available through the World Bank in these villages that we're working. At the very least, using something like this, not looking at the sponsored children, but all the children in the community. And we'd expect that the impact would be smaller on each child, but we should, if the sample is big enough, we should be able to pick up an effect on the same kinds of adult outcomes.
So I really was really intrigued by the international relationship, kind of the partnership program that you set forth, particularly because it seems like the American church is really moving towards short-term missions, especially in what churches are supporting and putting funds towards. And then also the way you talked about this evening, how a lot of times with short-term missions, there's a problem that becomes much more like an individualistic focus, like between that person and their relationship with God as opposed to concern for the people they're serving. So in this international partnership focus, where do you see short-term mission trips playing a role, particularly with the cost associated with those?
Well, with my partners, with organizations that I help lead, we do short-term mission trips all the time. But there's a difference. I guess what I want to point out is there's a difference between, I think a very big difference, between short-term mission trips where a group goes down to Mexico and builds houses for a week, comes back and never sees the village again. So there's no long-term relationship at all. And this is maybe the majority of short-term mission trips. So compare that to a church somewhere that has, through some organization or through somebody's sponsored child or who knows how, has developed a relationship with a village in Ecuador. And so every year, at least every couple of years, they send a short-term group down, right? And there may be a couple people in the church that are really in contact with this village. On Sundays, they bring up prayer requests from the village. Oh, they had an outbreak of cholera in the village. We need to be praying for these guys. Pastor Juan down in the village says that this is going on. Let's pray for them. Half the people in the church have been down there on a short-term mission. That's an international partnership model. That where short-term missions, just this continual flow of people, maybe even some people, then flying some people up to the States to report on how it's going in the village, right? So it's how you do them, I think. And it's also how you do the incarnational model. Maybe the partnership model involves one person from the church or a missionary from the denomination being there, right? And then the church goes to visit regularly. But it's still a long-term partnership model. It's not this sort of 2 years and out, 5 years and out kind of thing. It's just this long-term commitment. I think like as Christians, we get overwhelmed. We're told in church and we learn these things in college about globalization and how many poor people are. We just get completely overwhelmed with the problems of the world. And when I graduated from Wheaton College and I had this education, I don't know what to do with it. And I think my advice would be focus. You can't solve all the world's problems, but ask God to sort of show you what little corner of the world you're meant to have an impact on, and be committed to that little tiny corner. And if everybody did just what you did, man, think of the impact. So it's okay to focus. It's okay to say, no, I'm not going to worry as much about these other places. I'm going to worry about these people that God's given me to be my friends and to partner with.
Have you looked into unintended consequences and kind of like the effects on perhaps kids moving out of their villages in search of better jobs, or drops in gender inequalities or AIDS in areas where these programs have been run?
Yeah, that's a great thought. So yeah, let me tell you a story related to your question about Guatemala. So in our survey, we didn't collect this data very well in other countries, but in Guatemala, we had a couple questions about drinking and smoking. Because if you're an evangelical in Guatemala and you drink beer, it's like the juice of the devil down there, right? And for a good reason, because there's no resistance to it. And so it kind of is. You see people passed out in the streets all the time. Because typically indigenous people can't have one beer, it's 12, right? And so drinking is seen as a grave sin in many indigenous communities, right? So we asked the question, does this person drink? And we actually saw that there were more smokers and drinkers among sponsored kids than their siblings who weren't sponsored. And I'm thinking, what is compassion teaching these guys in these tutoring groups, right? And so we went back and we asked them, what is going on? You guys are raising up this legion of smokers and drinkers. And I said, I know, it's terrible. We don't have a secondary school here, and so the sponsored kids have to go to Guatemala City to complete their secondary school, and they pick up so many bad habits there. They become drinkers and smokers, and there you go. And a lot of people from small villages, the more education you have, the more likely you are to out-migrate where the division of labor is higher to get a job as a programmer or a manager or something, because there just aren't those jobs in the village. Hopefully remittances come back to the village and there's some effect of it. It's definitely an issue, no question. And one of the people in my partners has talked about starting a small-scale enterprise in our village. His idea is a paintbrush factory. He's an engineer, so he kind of thinks that way. But he thinks there could be this really big market for these very kind of simple goods that he knows how to maintain the machines for and could train people to do that, to actually try to create some work within our village.
I add my thanks to you for a wonderful lecture and a wonderful time this evening. And you're bringing together the wonderful dynamics that we try to create here at Wheaton, that is bringing a discipline in full integration with our love and compassion for Christ, and being able to take that into the world, whether it's just down the street or across the continent or whatever. Would you share with us what motivates you, how you were mentored, and how you came to undertake this career that you're taking so seriously?
Well, I was an undergraduate at UC Davis and had no interest at all in international stuff. And even though I was a Christian, but I went to what was then called Eastern College, and for one semester of graduate school, and was a student of Ron Sider and Tony Campolos, and did an internship with them in the Dominican Republic with microfinance, and yeah, the rest of it was kind of sort of emerged from that. But yeah, I think I've had a lot of friends that have kind of come alongside me and encouraged me that are non-economists, you know, and I've been inspired by a lot of different types of people to do this work. So just thank God for the those influences.
I think we're about out of time. We have been delighted at our presentations. Bruce, thank you very much. Let's give a warm. Before you all leave, please fill out the assessment and evaluation forms and feel free to speak with Bruce as you leave. Thank you.